Good morning, good afternoon, third and fourth graders. This is your new Read Aloud book for reading this week. It is going to relate to last week's book, Pepe the Lamplighter. Now, if you remember in this book, Pepe was a young child whose family had immigrated to the United States and was trying to find work and be successful. Pepe got a job as a lamplighter to help out his large family, and his dad was upset about it at first, but eventually was happy to know that Pepe could help them out. This is going to relate to our new book for today, which is called Coming to America. This is all about immigration and what it was like for people coming to the United States. Now, I'm not going to read the entire book. It is quite long. We're going to break it up into chunks. We're going to be reading pages 3 through 13, and then we're going to be looking at page 20 through 29. Now, in the past, in social studies, we've talked about a little bit what it was like for people to come to the United States. They wanted to come so they could see maybe a new religion or freedom of religion. Sorry, that was Molly coming through. Maybe they wanted to try to get better job opportunities. There were many reasons people would come to the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of read aloud from the book, Coming to America. Coming to America, The Story of Immigration by Betsy, Maestro, and illustrated by Susanna Ryan. America is a nation of immigrants. Immigrants are people who come to a new land to make their home. All Americans are related to immigrants or are immigrants themselves. Thousands of years ago, there were no people at all in the Americas. Then, during the last great ice age, nomads crossed over a land bridge from Asia to what is now Alaska. These early hunters wandered here more or less by accident, searching for food. American Indians, called Native Americans, are distant relatives of the ancient hunters who arrived in North America so very long ago. They were the first immigrants to arrive in what is truly a new world. As many more thousands of years passed, the descendants of the first hunters moved around North and South America. They settled in small villages and later built big cities. By the time Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, millions of people lived in the great civilization of the Americas. Now remember, this is both talking about South and North America right now. After Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean, other Europeans explorers came in search of land and riches for their own countries. Stories about the fascinating new world spread throughout Europe. In time, settlers followed the explorers' routes across the great ocean. These European immigrants came to make new homes in the Americas. They came in search of a better life, one free of the trouble and hardship that they left behind. In their native countries, they often had little money and could not worship God in the way they wished. The immigrants hoped for freedom and good fortune in their new lives. By about 1700, thousands of settlers lived in the Spanish, French, and English colonies of North America. Other new Americans had arrived from the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Finland, and Wales. As the population grew, the Europeans competed with the Indians for land and food. The Indians were pushed off their land and were often treated badly or killed. Not all immigrants came to America because they wanted to. Beginning in 1619, millions of Africans were brought to the Americas against their will and were forced into slavery. Instead of finding freedom, these Americans lost theirs, and most never returned to their homelands so very far away. During the 1700s, settlers continued to come to the American colonies. Irish, and Swiss settlers came too in search of a better life, wanting to have land on their own and enough food to fill their hungry stomachs. Their hope for a future gave the immigrants courage to face the long and difficult sea voyage. Early sailing ships took months to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The living spaces were very cramped and and often there wasn't enough food or water. Stormy seas made shipboard life even more miserable. I'm going to be skipping to page 20. Now we're going to go ahead a couple hundred years. Before 1820, no one had recorded the exact number of immigrants who had arrived in the United States. But the number of immigrants were growing so rapidly that some states passed their own immigration laws to keep track of newcomers. In 1875, the United States government began to regulate immigration. It wanted to know more about the people who were arriving daily on American shores. A number of years later, the government began to limit immigration by saying that people from other countries could not come to the United States at all. Between 1855 and 1890, Castle Garden in New York City served as a depot for immigration. More than 8 million people passed through this port of entry. A few years later, on January 11, 1892, the United States government opened an immigration center on Ellis Island near New York City. Officials from the island would count and question the new arrivals. They would see that those admitted were healthy and ready to become useful citizens. On the day that Ellis Island opened, the first person to step ashore was Annie Moore. She was a 15-year-old girl from Ireland. She had traveled with her two brothers to join their parents who had settled in the United States 3 years earlier. As big passenger ships entered the New York harbor, the immigrants caught their first glimpse of what they hoped would be their new country. They saw the Statue of Liberty, a welcome and inspiring sight. The travelers were relieved that their journey was over, but they worried about what awaited them on Ellis Island. Inspectors from the island boarded the ships at anchor to check the passengers. Wealthy passengers traveling first class were usually allowed to leave the ship right away. The inspectors looked for signs of contagious disease among the others. Those who were ill sometimes stayed aboard the ship or were sent to the other islands to recover. Those who seemed healthy enough were taken to Ellis Island. On the busiest days, so many ships arrived in New York Harbor that there were long waits just to get to Ellis Island. Sometimes the wait was so long that people had to live aboard the ship for a few extra days. Once on the island, there was more waiting. With thousands arriving each day, long lines formed everywhere. First, the immigrants were given a quick examination by doctors. Those with health problems were marked with colored chalk. The doctors would examine these persons more closely. Some people were kept on the island for observation. After 1911, Ellis Island had its own hospital to treat the sick. Sometimes, immigrants had permanent health problems that would make it hard for them to work. This often meant that they would be sent back to their native country. But most of the new arrivals passed inspection and moved on to the next step. Now the immigrants were asked a long list of questions. Inspectors asked their names, where they were from, and how much money they had. Since most of the immigrants did not speak English, they needed help in understanding and answering the questions. Translators did what they could to help the inspectors and newcomers understand one another. Even though it was difficult, most managed somehow to answer all the questions. Mothers often spoke for children who might be too little or too scared to speak. The immigrants had to show that they would work very hard and stay out of trouble. Usually the ordeal was over within the day. When they received their entry cards at last, the immigrants could officially enter their new country. Okay, so we got to find out some interesting information about the first people that lived in our land, the Americas, the North American area we lived in, and the South American area below us. And then we skipped ahead and we got to find out a little bit more in detail about the immigration process that I also sort of discussed in social studies at one point. So what you're going to be responsible for doing is going on to Google Classroom and answering some questions from today's reading. This week, your book, Coming to America, is going to be popping up then in more of your assignments. So be sure to be checking out Google Classroom for those.